I discovered my husband was sleeping with a food critic to get our restaurant fake reviews. But as I stood in our kitchen, holding the evidence of their affair, my phone buzzed with a text from him. Cook tonight's special menu. The investors are coming. Followed by 12 missed calls. Hi, my name is Maria Rossetti, 29 years old, and I just uncovered the truth about how our restaurant really earned its Michelin star. It should have been the proudest moment of my culinary career, but from the very beginning, I was never the face of our success. For 3 years, I worked as the invisible force behind Bella Vista, our Italian restaurant in downtown Portland. Every morning at 4 a.m., I'd slip into the kitchen while the city still slept, my hands already moving through the familiar rhythm of prep work. Chopping mountains of fresh herbs, rolling pasta dough until it was silk smooth, reducing wine and stock into rich, complex sauces that would become the foundation of our daily specials. The scents of garlic, basil, and slow-simmering tomatoes filled the air as I crafted dishes that had taken me years to perfect. But when the local food bloggers arrived for lunch, when the wine critics came for dinner, when the investors toured our dining room, it was Antonio who greeted them with his charismatic smile and perfect Italian accent. He'd guide them to the best table, pour them our finest wine, and describe each dish as if he'd personally conceived and prepared it. This osso buco recipe has been in my family for generations, he'd say, gesturing dramatically with his hands. The secret is in the slow braising technique I learned from my nonna in Tuscany. The truth was, I had developed that recipe during my final semester at Le Cordon Bleu, combining classical French braising methods with the rustic Italian flavors my own grandmother had taught me in her small kitchen in Brooklyn. But Antonio told the story with such conviction, such passion, that even I sometimes forgot who had actually created the dish. From the outside, we looked like the perfect culinary power couple. Antonio, tall and handsome with salt and pepper hair and an easy laugh, handled the front-of-house operations. I, quiet and focused, managed the kitchen with surgical precision. Food and Wine magazine had even featured us in an article titled Marriage Made in Heaven, How Love Creates the Best Restaurants. The photographer had posed us together in our kitchen, Antonio's arm around my waist as I held a plate of my signature lobster ravioli. The caption read, Chef Antonio Rossetti and his wife Maria bring passion to every dish at Bella Vista. Chef Antonio Rossetti. Not Chef Maria. Not even the Rossettis. Just Antonio, with me described as his wife who helped out. I told myself this arrangement worked. Antonio was naturally gifted with people, charming investors, and food critics with stories and laughter, while I preferred the quiet concentration of the kitchen. When customers raved about our food, when food bloggers gave us glowing reviews, when we won local culinary awards, I felt proud knowing that my hands had created the dishes they celebrated. It didn't matter who got the credit as long as people enjoyed my food. But looking back now, I can see how the imbalance began to erode something inside me. During interviews, Antonio would speak about our creative process and our signature techniques without ever specifically mentioning that I was the one who developed every recipe, every sauce, every innovative dish that made Bella Vista special. Food writers would ask detailed questions about ingredients and preparation methods, and Antonio would answer confidently, having memorized the descriptions I'd written for our menu. There were moments when I felt invisible in my own restaurant. I remember one evening when a prominent food blogger was dining with friends at table 12. They loved the wild mushroom risotto so much they asked to meet the chef. Antonio emerged from the kitchen wearing a chef's coat he'd barely worn during service, accepting their praise and taking photos while I watched from behind the pass, my hands still stained with porcini dust from stirring that risotto for 45 minutes until it reached the perfect creamy consistency. The key, Antonio told them, his voice carrying across the dining room, is using arborio rice and adding the stock one ladle at a time. It's a technique that requires patience and intuition. I had taught him those exact words during our first year, when he'd insisted on learning enough culinary terminology to sound credible during customer interactions. The blogger posted the review the next week, describing Antonio as a master craftsman who brings old-world techniques to contemporary American dining. The photo showed Antonio holding my risotto, his smile bright with satisfaction. I wasn't mentioned at all. Still, I convinced myself that recognition would come eventually. We were building something together, and partnerships required sacrifice. When we received our first James Beard nomination for Best Chef Northwest, I was thrilled, even though only Antonio's name appeared on the nomination. When Food Network approached us about featuring Bella Vista on a special about rising restaurants, I spent weeks perfecting the dishes we'd showcase, even though I knew I'd remain behind the camera. The real shift began 6 months ago when Victoria Sterling started visiting regularly. Victoria was the food critic for Portland Monthly, known for her ruthless honesty and the power to make or break restaurants with a single review. She was elegant in that effortless way some women achieve, with silver hair swept into a perfect chignon and an extensive knowledge of wine that intimidated even experienced sommeliers. The first time she came in, Antonio was almost nervous, which was unusual for him. He seated her at our best table, the one by the window with a view of the river, and personally selected a bottle of Barolo from our most expensive collection. He spent the entire evening hovering near her table, refilling her wine glass and asking about each course with an attentiveness I'd never seen him show regular customers. "She's considering us for the Best New Restaurant feature," he explained when I asked why he was acting so different. "This could change everything for us, Maria." A good review from Victoria Sterling could get us noticed by the Michelin Guide. I spent that entire service in a state of anxiety, tasting and retasting every dish that went to her table, making sure the seasoning was perfect, the presentation flawless. The braised short rib was tender enough to cut with a fork. The handmade pappardelle was silky and perfectly al dente. The chocolate soufflé rose exactly as it should, emerging from the oven with a delicate crust and molten center. Victoria left that night without saying a word to me, though she spent 10 minutes talking with Antonio by the door. I watched from the kitchen window as they exchanged business cards and laughed at something he'd said. When he returned to the kitchen, he was practically glowing. "She loved everything," he told me, pulling me into a hug that smelled of wine and her expensive perfume. "She wants to come back next week for another tasting. She's thinking about doing a full feature on us." Over the following months, Victoria became a regular fixture at Bella Vista. She'd call ahead to book private tastings, always on nights when the restaurant was closed, always requesting that Antonio personally oversee her dining experience. These weren't ordinary restaurant visits but elaborate 7-course affairs that I'd spend entire days preparing. I'd arrive early on those evenings to begin the intensive preparation. First, checking every ingredient for perfection, selecting the finest cuts of meat, the most pristine vegetables, the freshest seafood flown in that morning from the coast. Then hours of careful cooking, timing each course so that Victoria would experience the meal exactly as I intended it. Meanwhile, Antonio would transform the dining room into something resembling a private chef's table experience. He'd dim the lights, light candles, select music that perfectly complemented the meal's progression. He'd polish the wine glasses until they sparkled and arrange flowers from the farmer's market in simple, elegant bouquets. I'd watch through the service window as they dined together, Victoria taking careful notes between courses, Antonio pouring wine with the practiced grace of a sommelier. Their conversations stretched long into the night, their laughter growing warmer with each bottle they opened. Sometimes I'd stay until midnight, cleaning the kitchen while they finished their meal, listening to the rise and fall of their voices in the dining room. "This is how relationships work in the restaurant industry," Antonio explained when I mentioned that these private dinners were becoming frequent. "Food critics need to understand not just the food but the philosophy behind it, the story we're telling through our cuisine. Victoria appreciates the artistry of what we do." What struck me was how knowledgeable Antonio had become about the technical aspects of cooking during these sessions. I'd hear him explaining the science behind my pasta-making technique, describing the specific temperatures required for perfect risotto, discussing the complexity of flavor layering in my signature sauces. He'd learned my methods so thoroughly that he could speak about them as if they were his own discoveries. The breakthrough came 4 months ago when Victoria published her review of Bella Vista. It was unlike anything she'd ever written, 3 full pages of poetic description and technical analysis. She called our food transcendent and a perfect marriage of innovation and tradition. She described Antonio as a chef's chef, someone who understands that great cooking is both art and science. The review was so glowing, so detailed and passionate, that it felt almost intimate to read. She wrote about the soul-stirring quality of our braised short rib, the architectural perfection of our desserts, the way our tasting menu told a story of love and mastery. Reading it, I felt a strange mixture of pride and unease. Pride because she was describing my food, my techniques, my creativity. Unease because the way she wrote about Antonio seemed to go beyond professional admiration. Within days of the review's publication, everything changed. Food bloggers from Seattle and San Francisco made reservations weeks in advance. The James Beard Foundation reached out about hosting an event. Most importantly, we received a call from the Michelin Guide, informing us that we were being considered for our first star. Antonio was ecstatic. He framed Victoria's review and hung it prominently in the front entrance. He ordered new business cards that featured a quote from her article. He started giving interviews to food magazines, always referencing the review and his friendship with Victoria. "She really understands what we're trying to achieve here," he'd tell reporters. "Victoria sees beyond the food to the artistry, the passion, the story we're telling through our cuisine." The Michelin star came 3 weeks later. The day we received the call, Antonio opened our most expensive bottle of champagne and toasted to our success in the empty restaurant. We stood in the dining room that afternoon, sunlight streaming through the windows, holding crystal flutes filled with Dom Perignon that cost more than most people made in a day. "We did it, Maria," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "We're officially one of the best restaurants in the Pacific Northwest." I smiled and drank the champagne, but something felt hollow about the celebration. The star was the culmination of everything I'd worked toward, the recognition of years of 14-hour days, burned fingers, aching backs, and countless meals I'd poured my heart into creating. Yet it felt distant, like watching someone else receive an award I'd earned. That evening, we hosted a celebration dinner for food industry friends and local media. Antonio gave a speech thanking everyone who had supported us, mentioning our purveyors, our staff, our customers. When he thanked Victoria, who had come as our guest of honor, his voice took on a warmth I hadn't heard before. "Victoria Sterling didn't just review our restaurant," he said, raising his glass toward her table. "She understood our vision and shared it with the world. Her review changed everything for us, and we'll be forever grateful." Victoria smiled and nodded, but I noticed she was looking at Antonio, not at me. Throughout the dinner, I watched them from the kitchen, saw how their eyes found each other across the crowded dining room, how they seemed to share private jokes and meaningful glances. After the last guest left that night, I was cleaning the kitchen when I overheard Antonio on the phone in his office. His voice was low, intimate, nothing like his professional tone. "Tonight was perfect," he was saying. "You looked beautiful. I couldn't stop thinking about last Thursday. Yes, I know we have to be careful, but after the Michelin announcement, everything feels different. We're building something incredible together." My hands froze on the dish I was washing. Last Thursday. The night he'd said he was meeting with wine distributors but came home after midnight smelling like perfume. The night I'd fallen asleep waiting for him to share the details of what he'd claimed was an important business meeting. I stood motionless in the kitchen, soap suds dripping from my hands, as the pieces began falling into place. The private dinners. The glowing review. The way Victoria looked at him. The way he spoke about her with such reverence and gratitude. But I needed to be certain. I couldn't confront him based on suspicions and overheard conversations. So I began paying closer attention, watching for signs I'd been too trusting to notice before. The first confirmation came when I found a receipt in Antonio's jacket pocket while taking it to the dry cleaner. Dinner for two at Le Bernardin, the most expensive restaurant in the city, on a night when Antonio had told me he was visiting his sick aunt in Seattle. The receipt was dated 3 weeks ago, and the total was more than we'd spent on our last anniversary dinner. Then I noticed changes in his routine. He'd always been meticulous about his appearance, but lately he was taking longer showers, using expensive cologne I hadn't bought him, getting his hair cut more frequently. He'd started working out regularly, something he'd never shown interest in before, and had bought new clothes, stylish shirts, and jackets I'd never seen. His phone had become precious to him in a way it never was before. He carried it everywhere, even into the bathroom. He'd received texts during dinner service that made him smile in a way that seemed secretive and private. When I'd ask who was texting, he'd say it was food bloggers or potential investors, people who wanted meetings or interviews. The final piece of evidence came 2 weeks ago when I decided to stay late after service to work on new menu ideas. Antonio thought I'd gone home, and I let him believe that, curious to see what he'd do with privacy in the restaurant. I waited in the office upstairs, lights off, listening to him move around downstairs. About an hour after closing, I heard the front door chime. Through the window, I could see Victoria's car in the parking lot. My heart started racing, but I forced myself to remain calm, to gather evidence rather than confront them immediately. I crept down the stairs and positioned myself where I could see into the dining room without being noticed. Antonio had set up one of our intimate corner tables with candles and wine. Victoria was there, but not as a food critic conducting business. She was there as a woman on a date, wearing a dress I'd never seen her wear to the restaurant, her hair down instead of in its usual professional chignon. They weren't talking about food or reviews or restaurant business. They were talking like lovers, holding hands across the table, speaking in low, intimate voices. When Antonio leaned across to kiss her, my stomach dropped, but I forced myself to keep watching, to see everything clearly. What happened next was even worse than the affair itself. Victoria pulled out a notebook, and they began going through what appeared to be recipes. My recipes. I watched Antonio show her the notebook I kept in the kitchen office, the one containing years of recipe development, technique notes, and culinary innovations I'd spent countless hours perfecting. The mushroom risotto is perfect for the cookbook, I heard Victoria say, her voice carrying in the quiet restaurant. The technique with the truffle oil and the specific timing for the stock additions. No one will know it originated from Maria's notebook. She's incredibly talented, Antonio replied, and for a moment I thought he was defending me. But she doesn't understand the business side. She's content to cook and let other people handle the recognition. This way, her techniques get shared with a wider audience. Victoria laughed, a sound that seemed sharp in the candlelit dining room. Your wife is gifted, but she lacks vision. She creates beautiful food but doesn't know how to turn it into a brand, a story people want to be part of. That's what we're doing. We're taking her raw talent and turning it into something bigger. I stood frozen in the stairway, my entire worldview crumbling around me. This wasn't just an affair. This was theft on a massive scale. Victoria wasn't planning to feature my techniques in an article or cookbook with proper credit. She was planning to claim them as discoveries she'd made while collaborating with Antonio. I watched them for another hour, documenting their conversation on my phone, taking photos of them sharing my recipe notebook. They discussed specific dishes I'd created, techniques I'd developed, flavor combinations I'd spent months perfecting. Victoria made notes about adapting my recipes for her upcoming cookbook, talking about which TV cooking shows might feature the techniques. The pasta-making method alone could be worth a Food Network segment, she said, turning pages in my notebook. And the sauce reduction technique could be the basis for an entire chapter on building complex flavors. When they finally left together, walking to Victoria's car with their arms around each other, I remained hidden until I was certain they were gone. Then I went down to the kitchen and sat at my prep station, surrounded by the tools and ingredients that had defined my life for the past 3 years. Everything I'd believed about my marriage, my career, my partnership with Antonio, had been built on lies. The recognition we'd received, the Michelin star, the glowing reviews, none of it was based on merit. It was the result of an elaborate scheme where my husband traded my recipes and my body of work for personal gain and sexual gratification. But what devastated me more than the betrayal was the realization of how thoroughly I'd been exploited. For 3 years, I'd worked 14-hour days creating the food that made our restaurant successful. I'd developed every signature dish, every innovative technique, every recipe that food critics celebrated. And while I labored in obscurity, Antonio had been presenting my work as his own to advance both his career and his affair. I sat in that kitchen until dawn, my mind cycling through memories that now looked completely different. Every interview where Antonio discussed his techniques. Every award ceremony where he accepted recognition for his food. Every conversation with investors where he described his vision for the restaurant's future. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, the social events I'd missed because I was working, the family gatherings I'd skipped to perfect a new dish. I thought about the burns on my hands from years of working over hot stoves, the chronic back pain from long hours standing in the kitchen, the exhaustion that had become so constant I'd stopped noticing it. All of it so that Antonio could present himself as a celebrated chef while carrying on an affair with the food critic whose corrupt reviews had made our success possible. When Antonio came in the next morning, whistling and cheerful, I was still sitting at my prep station. He looked surprised to see me there so early, but didn't seem suspicious. "You're up early today," he said, kissing my forehead in a gesture that now felt like mockery. "Sleep okay?" I looked up at him, this man I'd trusted with my recipes, my techniques, my career, and my heart. "We need to talk," I said quietly. His expression shifted slightly, but he maintained his casual demeanor. "Sure, what's going on?" "Problems with the new menu." "I know about Victoria," I said simply. The color drained from his face, but he tried to maintain his composure. "What do you mean?" "Victoria's been incredibly supportive of the restaurant. I saw you together last night. I heard your conversation about my recipes. I know about the cookbook, the TV shows, the way you've been stealing my work to impress your girlfriend." Antonio sat down heavily in the chair across from me. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the stainless steel prep table where I'd spent thousands of hours creating the food he'd claimed as his own. "Maria, it's not what you think," he began, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's exactly what I think," I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded. "You've been having an affair with Victoria Sterling. She's been giving us fake reviews based on your personal relationship rather than the quality of our food. And you've been sharing my recipes, my techniques, and my innovations with her so she can profit from them without giving me credit." Antonio ran his hands through his hair, the same gesture he'd made during our wedding vows when he promised to honor and cherish me. "The reviews weren't fake, Maria. Victoria genuinely loves our food. She loves what we've built here." "She loves what I built here," I corrected. "Every dish she praised in that review, every technique she called innovative, every recipe she's planning to steal for her cookbook, all of it came from me. You just served as the middleman." He looked up at me then, and instead of shame or apology, I saw something that shocked me. Justification. Even caught in the act, he believed he was right. "Maria, you're incredibly talented, but you don't understand how this industry works. You create beautiful food, but you have no interest in the business side, the networking, the relationships that make restaurants successful. Victoria and we're building something bigger than just this restaurant. We're creating a brand, a story, a legacy." "With my work," I said, my voice finally starting to rise. "Using my recipes, my techniques, my innovations. While I work 14-hour days in obscurity, you take credit for everything I create and use it to advance your affair." "It's not that simple," Antonio said, his tone becoming defensive. "Yes, I've developed feelings for Victoria, but our professional relationship came first. She saw the potential in what we're doing here, the vision we could achieve together. You should be grateful that your food is finally getting the recognition it deserves." I stared at him in disbelief. "Grateful? You want me to be grateful that you're stealing my life's work to impress another woman?" "I'm not stealing anything," he said, standing up and beginning to pace. "We're married, Maria. What's yours is mine, what's mine is yours. That's how partnerships work. You focus on the cooking, I handle the business and the recognition. It's always worked that way." "It's worked that way because I was naive enough to trust you," I replied. "But this isn't a partnership, Antonio. Partnerships require honesty and mutual respect. What you've done is exploitation." He stopped pacing and looked at me with frustration. "So what do you want me to do? End my relationship with Victoria? Stop pursuing opportunities that could make us both successful? You've never wanted the spotlight, Maria. You've always been content to stay in the kitchen and let me handle everything else. I want you to acknowledge that every recipe in that notebook, every technique Victoria is planning to steal, every dish that earned us our Michelin star, came from me. I want you to admit that our success was built on my work, not your charm." Antonio was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. Fine. You're a talented chef, Maria. Your food is exceptional. But talent without vision, without business sense, without the ability to build relationships and create opportunities, is just talent. Victoria and I understand how to turn your recipes into something bigger, something that reaches more people and creates lasting success. In that moment, I understood that Antonio wasn't going to apologize or change or acknowledge the magnitude of what he'd done. In his mind, he'd been doing me a favor by taking credit for my work. He genuinely believed that his ability to charm critics and investors was more valuable than my years of culinary training and creativity. I'm leaving, I said quietly, standing up from the prep table. Leaving what? The restaurant. Our marriage. You can't just walk away from everything we've built together. Everything I built, I corrected. And yes, I'm walking away from all of it. But not quietly, and not without taking what's rightfully mine. Over the next 2 weeks, while Antonio assumed I was simply angry and would eventually forgive him, I systematically documented everything. I photographed every page of my recipe notebooks, creating digital copies with timestamps that proved when I'd developed each dish. I recorded videos of myself preparing signature techniques, explaining the methods and reasoning behind each innovation. I also began having quiet conversations with our kitchen staff. Carlos, our sous chef, had worked with us since we opened and knew better than anyone who had created each recipe. Sophia, our pastry chef, had learned her advanced techniques directly from me during late-night training sessions. Marcus and David, our line cooks, had watched me develop and perfect every dish on our menu. We all know you're the real chef here, Carlos told me when I explained what I'd discovered. Antonio's got charm, but he couldn't cook a perfect risotto if his life depended on it. Everything that makes this place special came from you. I learned that the kitchen staff had been uncomfortable with the situation for months but had never felt it was their place to speak up. They'd watched Antonio take credit for techniques they'd seen me develop, recipes they'd helped me test and perfect, innovations that had emerged from collaborative late-night cooking sessions in the months before we opened. It's not right, Sophia said. Food critics interview Antonio about pastry techniques I know you taught him last week. He describes flavor combinations like he discovered them, but I was here when you spent 3 months getting the proportions perfect. The staff's loyalty wasn't just professional, it was personal. I'd trained each of them individually, sharing not just techniques but philosophy, teaching them to taste and adjust and create rather than simply follow recipes. While Antonio had been charming investors and food critics, I'd been building the actual foundation of our restaurant success. If you ever decide to open your own place, Marcus said, you know we'd follow you anywhere. Working with a real chef instead of someone who just plays one for the cameras, that's the dream. I also began researching Victoria Sterling's background and discovered a pattern of ethical violations that explained why her review of our restaurant had been so unusually glowing. Over the past 2 years, she'd given overwhelmingly positive reviews to 3 restaurants owned by men she'd been romantically involved with. The relationships had been discreet, but food industry insiders had noticed the pattern. I contacted other food critics, restaurant owners, and culinary professionals, sharing my concerns about Victoria's compromised reviews. Several people told me they'd had similar suspicions but hadn't felt comfortable speaking up without concrete evidence. The restaurant industry is small, one established food critic told me. We all noticed that Victoria's reviews became more personal and less analytical over the past couple of years. But proving bias is difficult unless someone on the inside is willing to speak up. I prepared a comprehensive report documenting Victoria's pattern of unethical behavior, complete with timeline evidence showing how her reviews coincided with her personal relationships. I also included recordings of the conversation I'd witnessed between her and Antonio, where they discussed stealing my recipes for her cookbook. But my most important preparation was planning my own future. I'd been a chef long before I met Antonio, and I would continue being a chef after our divorce. Using my savings and a small business loan, I found a location for my own restaurant 6 blocks away from Bella Vista. The space was smaller and needed renovation, but it had good bones and a perfect kitchen layout. I signed the lease under my maiden name, Romano, and began planning a restaurant that would finally showcase my food without compromise or shared credit. I decided to call it Nonna's table, honoring my grandmother who had first taught me to cook in her tiny Brooklyn kitchen. She'd been a woman who understood that food was love made tangible, that cooking for others was both service and art. Her spirit would guide this new venture, built on integrity rather than exploitation. 2 weeks after my confrontation with Antonio, I was ready to make my move. I chose a Tuesday morning, typically our quietest day of the week, to have the conversation that would end our marriage and partnership. I arrived at the restaurant early and set out 2 envelopes on the prep table where we'd had our first serious conversation about the affair. One contained my resignation letter and divorce papers. The other contained copies of all the evidence I'd gathered about his relationship with Victoria and their theft of my intellectual property. When Antonio walked into the kitchen, he seemed surprised by the formal setup but not particularly worried. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing to the envelopes. "The end," I said simply. "I'm leaving the restaurant and filing for divorce. These papers explain everything." Antonio opened the first envelope and read through my resignation letter, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Maria, you can't just leave. We have reservations booked months in advance. We have the Michelin star. You can't abandon everything we've built." "Everything I built," I corrected, handing him the second envelope. "And I'm not abandoning it. I'm taking it with me." As Antonio read through the evidence I'd compiled, photographs of him and Victoria together, recordings of their conversations, documentation of the stolen recipes, I watched his face cycle through shock, anger, and finally, fear. "You've been documenting us," he said, his voice hollow. "Recording private conversations. Taking photos. That's not legal, Maria. You can't use any of this." "Actually, I can," I replied. "Oregon is a one-party consent state for recording conversations. And photographing people in a public restaurant isn't illegal. But more importantly, I'm not planning to use this in court. I'm planning to share it with the food industry professionals who've been supporting Victoria's corrupt career." Antonio set down the papers and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not love, not anger, but calculation. He was trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to his reputation and career. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Money. A settlement. A percentage of the restaurant's profits." "I want my recipes back," I said. "I want Victoria's cookbook deal cancelled. I want her removed from her position at Portland Monthly. And I want acknowledgement that every significant dish this restaurant has ever served was created by me." "That's impossible," Antonio said immediately. "Victoria's cookbook deal is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Her position at the magazine is prestigious and well-established. And if I admit that you created all our recipes, it undermines everything we've achieved here." "Everything I've achieved," I said. "And yes, it does undermine it. Because it was all built on lies." I stood up and walked toward the kitchen door. "You have 48 hours to decide. Either you publicly acknowledge the truth about who created this restaurant's food, or I share everything I've documented with the James Beard Foundation, the Michelin Guide, Portland Monthly's editorial board, and every food blogger and critic in the Pacific Northwest." "You're destroying both of our careers," Antonio called after me. I turned back to look at him one last time. "No, Antonio. I'm finally building mine." Over the next 2 days, Antonio called me dozens of times, leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading to threatening to genuinely confused. He seemed to believe that our marriage and business partnership gave him permanent rights to my creative work, that he could continue using my recipes and techniques regardless of our relationship status. Victoria also reached out, her messages more calculating and professional. She offered to give me co-credit in her cookbook, to mention my contributions in magazine articles, to help me build my own media presence. But she never offered to cancel the cookbook deal or return my recipes. Like Antonio, she seemed to believe that her ability to market and promote my work was more valuable than the work itself. I ignored both of them and focused on preparing for my new restaurant. Carlos, Sophia, Marcus, and David all gave their notice at Bella Vista and agreed to join me at Nonna's table. We spent long days renovating the space, installing equipment, testing recipes, and building the team dynamic that would define our success. This feels different, Sophia said as we worked on perfecting the dessert menu. Like we're building something real instead of just helping someone else take credit for our work. The 48-hour deadline passed without any acknowledgement from Antonio. So I began sharing my evidence with food industry professionals, starting with Portland Monthly's editorial board. The magazine's editor-in-chief, Jennifer Walsh, agreed to meet with me within days of receiving my initial email. I showed her everything: the recordings of Victoria and Antonio discussing stolen recipes, the photos of them together during what should have been professional restaurant visits, the timeline showing how Victoria's reviews had become increasingly compromised over the past year. "This is serious," Jennifer said after reviewing everything. "If Victoria has been writing reviews based on personal relationships rather than professional assessment, it undermines the integrity of our entire publication." Within a week, Victoria Sterling was terminated from Portland Monthly. The magazine published a brief statement about ethical violations and conflicts of interest but didn't provide specific details. Victoria's cookbook deal was also cancelled when her publisher learned about the stolen recipe controversy. The James Beard Foundation launched its own investigation after I shared my documentation with them. While they didn't revoke any awards retroactively, they did implement new guidelines requiring more detailed verification of recipe origins and chef credentials. The Michelin Guide was more circumspect, but I noticed that when they published their updated recommendations 6 months later, Bella Vista had been quietly removed from the list. Meanwhile, Nonna's Table was generating excitement even before we opened. Word spread through the food community about my departure from Bella Vista and the reasons behind it. Food bloggers who had suspected something unusual about Victoria's reviews began reaching out for interviews. When we finally opened 3 months after I'd left Bella Vista, we had reservations booked solid for the first 2 months. Food critics came not just to try my food but to witness what they saw as a story of artistic independence and integrity triumphing over exploitation. The opening night was everything I'd dreamed of during those lonely years when my food was celebrated but my name remained unknown. Local food writers photographed me in my own kitchen, wearing chef's whites with my name embroidered over the pocket. They interviewed me about my techniques, my influences, my vision for the restaurant's future. "This osso buco is extraordinary," one critic said as I explained the dish. "The depth of flavor, the tenderness of the meat, the complexity of the sauce. How did you develop this technique?" For the first time in years, I could answer honestly. I spent months perfecting the braising method during my final semester at Le Cordon Bleu, combining classical French techniques with Italian flavors my grandmother taught me. The key is the specific temperature control and the timing of when you add each component to build layers of flavor. No stolen credit, no false claims, no need to watch someone else take recognition for my work. Just honest conversation about food, technique, and the passion that drives great cooking. Within 6 months, Nonna's Table had earned its own Michelin star, this one based entirely on merit rather than corruption. The review praised not just the food but the integrity and authenticity of the dining experience. "Chef Maria Romano has created something special at Nonna's Table," the review read. "This is food that speaks of tradition and innovation, of technical skill and emotional honesty. Every dish tells a story, and every story is true." I framed that review and hung it in the kitchen where all my cooks could see it. Unlike the stolen praise that had decorated Bella Vista's walls, this recognition felt genuine, earned through honest work and authentic relationships. The success of Nonna's Table brought unexpected opportunities. Food Network reached out about featuring me in a documentary about chef entrepreneurship. Cooking magazines asked me to contribute articles about traditional Italian techniques and modern applications. Culinary schools invited me to give lectures about building authentic restaurant experiences. Each opportunity felt surreal after years of watching Antonio accept similar invitations for work I'd created. Now, when food writers asked detailed questions about my techniques, I could answer from personal experience rather than watching someone else recite descriptions I'd written. During one particularly meaningful interview, a young culinary student asked how I'd developed my signature pasta-making method. I explained the months of experimentation, the failures and adjustments, the moment when everything finally clicked together. As I spoke, I realized this was the first time I'd ever been able to tell the complete story of my own work. Food is personal, I told her. Every dish carries the story of who created it, their influences, their struggles, their discoveries. When that story gets stolen or misrepresented, it breaks something essential about what we do as chefs. Meanwhile, Bella Vista struggled without the kitchen team that had actually understood my recipes. Antonio hired new cooks, but they couldn't replicate the techniques and flavor profiles that had made the restaurant successful. Food bloggers began noticing inconsistencies in dishes they remembered loving during previous visits. The osso buco that was once transcendent now tastes ordinary, one reviewer wrote. The handmade pasta lacks the silky perfection it once possessed. It's as if the soul of the restaurant has departed along with some key personnel. Within 8 months of my departure, Bella Vista lost its Michelin star. The official reason cited was inconsistent execution and declining quality, but industry insiders understood the real story. Without the chef who had created the food that earned the recognition, the restaurant couldn't maintain the standards that had made it special. Antonio called me the day the Michelin decision was announced. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Maria, we need to talk," his voice sounded hollow, defeated. "The restaurant is falling apart. The new cooks can't execute your recipes properly. Customers are complaining about the quality decline." "They're not my recipes anymore," I replied calmly. "You made it clear that everything created in that kitchen belonged to the restaurant, not to me personally." "Please," Antonio said, and I heard something I'd never heard from him before. Desperation. "I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But we could work together again, as business partners if not as a married couple. You could consult on the menu, train the new staff, help us get back to where we were." I stood in my own kitchen at Nonna's table, surrounded by the tools and ingredients that now belonged completely to me, and felt nothing but pity for the man who had once controlled every aspect of my career. "Antonio, even if I wanted to help you, which I don't, it wouldn't work. Your success was built on stolen recipes and corrupt reviews. Without Victoria's biased coverage and without my uncredited work, Bella Vista was never sustainable." "But we had something real," he insisted. "The food was genuinely good. People loved eating there." "The food was genuinely good because I created it," I said. "People loved eating there because they were experiencing my culinary vision. But you never understood that, and you still don't." I hung up and never spoke to Antonio again. 6 months later, Bella Vista closed permanently. The final review in the local paper described it as a cautionary tale about restaurants that prioritize style over substance. As for Victoria, her career never recovered from the scandal. No major publication would hire her after the ethical violations became known in food industry circles. She eventually left Portland altogether, though I heard she was attempting to rebuild her reputation in a smaller market where her history was less well known. I felt no satisfaction in their failures. What had happened to them was simply the natural consequence of building careers on deception and exploitation. When the foundation is corrupt, the structure eventually collapses under its own weight. 2 years after opening Nonna's Table, I was invited to speak at a James Beard Foundation event about women in the culinary industry. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of chefs, food writers, and culinary students, I thought about the journey that had brought me there. For too many years, I believed that recognition wasn't important as long as people enjoyed my food, I told the audience. I convinced myself that credit didn't matter, that being behind the scenes was enough. But I learned that when we allow others to claim our work, we're not just being humble or selfless. We're participating in a system that devalues our contributions and makes it easier for others to exploit creative professionals. In the Q&A that followed, a young female chef asked how she could protect herself from similar exploitation. Her question reminded me of myself at 26, so eager to contribute to something bigger that I'd overlooked the warning signs of being taken advantage of. Document everything, I advised. Keep detailed records of your recipe development, your technique innovations, your creative process. Build relationships with colleagues who can verify your contributions. And most importantly, never be afraid to speak up when someone else is taking credit for your work. After the event, several people approached me with their own stories of having work stolen or credit misappropriated. I realized that my experience, while painful, had given me a platform to address issues that affected many people in creative professions. I started writing about these experiences, contributing articles to food magazines about intellectual property in restaurants, the importance of crediting kitchen staff appropriately, and the ethical responsibilities of food critics. My voice, silent for so many years, had finally found its purpose. 3 years after opening Nonna's Table, we expanded to include a culinary school where I could teach traditional techniques to the next generation of chefs. The school's motto, displayed prominently in every classroom, read, "Cook with integrity, create with honesty, and never let anyone steal your story." My first class included that young culinary student who had asked about my pasta-making technique during the magazine interview. Watching her master the methods I'd developed, seeing her add her own innovations and improvements, felt like the completion of a circle that had begun in my grandmother's Brooklyn kitchen decades earlier. The most important ingredient in any recipe, I told my students during their final exam, is the truth about who created it. Without that truth, even the most delicious food becomes hollow. On quiet Sunday evenings, when the restaurant was closed and the culinary school empty, I'd sit in my kitchen with a glass of wine and my grandmother's old recipe notebook. The pages were yellow with age, filled with measurements written in her careful handwriting and notes about techniques passed down through generations of Italian women. Looking at those recipes, I understood that food is memory made tangible, love transformed into nourishment, culture preserved through the simple act of cooking for others. What Antonio and Victoria had tried to steal wasn't just recipes or techniques or credit. They had tried to steal story itself, the essential narrative that connects food to the people who create it. But stories, I learned, cannot be permanently stolen. They can be suppressed, misattributed, or hidden, but eventually they find a way to be told in their authentic voice. The truth has a way of surfacing, especially when someone is brave enough to speak it aloud. For years after leaving Bella Vista, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping from a small town in Oregon where Victoria Sterling had been hired as a food writer for the local weekly paper. The article was about a new Italian restaurant and described their innovative osso buco preparation using techniques discovered by this writer during her research into traditional Italian cooking methods. The techniques she described were identical to the methods I'd developed years earlier, the same innovations she and Antonio had planned to claim for her cookbook. Even after everything that had happened, she was still trying to profit from my work. I showed the clipping to Carlos, who had become my partner in running Nonna's Table. He read it and shook his head with disgust. "Some people never learn," he said. "She's probably hoping no one in that small town will connect her to the scandal here." "Let her have it," I replied, surprising myself with how little anger I felt. Anyone who needs to steal recipes from a small-town food critic isn't building anything sustainable. The truth catches up eventually. I threw the clipping away and never thought about Victoria Sterling again. My energy was better spent on the work in front of me. Training new chefs, developing new recipes, building a business based on honesty and respect for everyone who contributed to its success. That summer, Nonna's Table was named Best Restaurant in the Pacific Northwest by Food and Wine magazine. The review specifically praised our authentic approach to Italian cuisine and our commitment to showcasing traditional techniques with modern applications. Unlike the stolen praise that had once decorated Bella Vista's walls, this recognition felt earned, clean, and sustainable. It was built on honest work by people who received proper credit for their contributions. Standing in my dining room on the night the review was published, surrounded by my team of chefs who had chosen to follow me from Bella Vista to build something genuine together, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced during my years of invisible labor. "This is what success looks like," I told them as we raised glasses of Chianti to celebrate. Not just awards or recognition, but the knowledge that everything we've achieved came from our own honest work. Sophia, now my head pastry chef and a partner in the business, smiled and added, "And no one can ever take this away from us because it's really ours." As the evening wound down and my team headed home to their families, I remained in the restaurant, walking slowly through the dining room and kitchen that represented everything I'd learned about standing up for my own worth. The walls displayed photos of our team in action, articles about our techniques and philosophy, and awards earned through legitimate means. But most prominently featured was my grandmother's recipe for Sunday gravy, framed and hanging where everyone could see it, with a small placard that read, "In memory of Rosa Romano, who taught me that the most important ingredient in any dish is the love and honesty of the person who creates it." 5 years after walking away from the life I'd thought I wanted, I had built something better than I'd ever imagined possible. Not just a successful restaurant or a respected culinary reputation, but a sense of integrity that no one could compromise or steal. I had learned that sometimes you have to lose everything you think you want in order to build what you actually need. You have to walk away from recognition that isn't really yours to earn recognition that genuinely is. And most importantly, I had learned that your worth as a creative professional isn't determined by who takes credit for your work, but by your courage to keep creating, keep improving, and keep insisting on the truth about what you've contributed to the world. That night, as I locked up Nonna's table and walked to my car under the Portland stars, I whispered a thank you to my grandmother, whose recipes had started it all, and to the younger version of myself who had finally found the strength to demand what she deserved. The story that had begun with betrayal and theft had transformed into something much more powerful, a testament to resilience, integrity, and the unshakable truth that authentic success is always worth the fight. Have you ever discovered that someone was taking credit for your work, your ideas, or your creative contributions? Have you ever felt invisible in your own success story, watching others receive praise for things you actually created? The kitchen, the boardroom, the artist's studio, the writer's desk. Wherever creativity happens, there's always the risk that someone else will try to claim what you've built with your own hands and heart. But remember this: your work belongs to you. Your story belongs to you. And no one has the right to steal either one, no matter how charming they are or how much power they seem to have. If you've lived through something similar, share your story in the comments below. Let's build a community where creative professionals support each other and refuse to stay silent when others try to take credit for our contributions. And remember, sometimes walking away from a situation where you're not valued is the first step toward building something where you finally are.